Hello listeners, this talk is the second part of a response to Adam Adams about white flight and some of the issues surrounding that. Yesterday, when I made the first recording to this response, I discussed various locations. I did analyses of various locations and what I thought to be the pros and cons of those locations internationally and also to some extent locally. What I'm going to do in this second part to the talk is discuss employment and also what to do with your wealth. So let me begin by saying that I think that a lot of the traditional white-collar jobs, middle-class white-collar jobs in the West are probably not going to exist for that much longer, or they will at least come under a lot of pressure. They will stagnate or perhaps even feel downward pressure upon wages and salaries and so on. And this is because of a number of factors to do with globalization and automation and so on and so forth that I think are going to just rip the gut out of these jobs in the not too distant future. To give you an example of this, I met a guy probably a year and a half ago, something like that, on a flight within Australia. And he had a number of businesses within Australia in different cities. He had a legal business. And so he needed the lawyers to be qualified and certified and so on within Australia. But anything else that he could outsource, he did. He had an entire IT department in the Philippines, and he had a manager running that IT department. I don't know what he paid the average worker in that department, but he told me that the manager, he paid about 60,000 Australian dollars a year, which was a lot of money for someone in the Philippines. That's pretty average in Australia. But he said if he had to pay someone that for that kind of job in Australia, he'd be looking, or he would have been looking at $250,000 Australian dollars. So the person in the Philippines was approximately a quarter of the cost. And that is increasingly going to be the case with all sorts of white-collar jobs, accountancy, all sorts of low and mid-level management jobs, you name it. Those kinds of jobs are increasingly going to be outsourced because it will be possible to do that, or they will be automated, or there'll be one person doing the job of 5 people previously, or they'll be training their replacement. In the US, for instance, there's a big push by certain people in the IT industry to get more H-1B, I think that's what they're called, visas, where essentially they'll bring in a bunch of Indians or Chinese who will do it for a lot less, and people have to train their replacements, essentially. That's going to be the case. Now, people will say, oh, but for every job that's lost in one sector, there'll be new jobs created in the future. I'm not entirely sure about this, to be honest. I think that technology will allow things to become greatly efficient to the point where it won't be a one-to-one replacement. There'll be more than one job lost and there'll be one job created. So that's going to be a net loss for the middle class, the white middle class in many Western nations. And I think that anyone who is sort of putting their eggs in that basket of doing the grinds through high school, university, trying to build up some sort of career where they do the commute for an hour each way, so 10 hours a week, and they go and do some sort of pen pushing job in an office, all of that sort of stuff, they're going to increasingly struggle. And I think also that a lot of those jobs need to be done in big cities, and so people get hit with the double whammy of the cost of living in those places also, or they have really long commutes, and of course that's sort of okay at the moment in terms of the cost, the financial cost, because of the low price of oil in the world at the moment. But if oil goes up a lot again, then those people are going to be in real trouble. Their commute is literally going to bankrupt them. Not to mention the time cost, of course. I think that's going to be a really bad option. Increasingly, it's going to be a really bad option. And I think actually that that in some ways going to make living in the countryside more attractive and more feasible. If these jobs and all of the other problems to do with living in big cities, to do with the vibrancy and the POS, the cost of living, and all of this sort of stuff, make it harder and harder to live in cities, then I think, why would you want to live in the city? I mean, there are other benefits, there's more stuff to do there, I suppose, in some ways. But I think that increasingly the advantages of these cities will be outweighed increasingly by the disadvantages, or the advantages will diminish as well. What I'm going to propose is something called a barbell strategy. This is a concept that I learned from Nassim Nicholas Taleb, and specifically in the area of investing. Now, I'll just give a brief aside about Nassim Nicholas Taleb. He's one of my favorite kind of public figures, public intellectuals, whatever you want to call him. He's had a very interesting life. He's Lebanese. His family are Greek Orthodox Lebanese, and they were very influential and important and wealthy and so on. They were heavily involved in Lebanese politics and so on and so forth. And they basically lost all of that in the Lebanese Civil War. And he talked about literally sitting in the basement reading books, all sorts of books, as the bombs were falling around them. And then he went to the West and he studied in the West. Actually, he studied at a French school, I believe, in Lebanon. And then he went to the West and he became an options trader. And another interesting thing that happened to him was he got, I think it was lung cancer or throat cancer or something, some sort of, I think it was lung cancer, but he wasn't a smoker. So it was this random thing that happened to him. And that and the outcome of his family fortune and all of this in Lebanon, the destruction of that, those things have very much influenced the way he regards risk and unforeseen circumstances and so on and so forth. And so he has written a lot about that. His most famous book is The Black Swan. And he's also I find him a very amusing character because he's not backward in coming forwards. I've seen a number of interviews where he's actually got very angry with people for asking him stupid questions. If he's dealing with dumb journalists, he'll actually call them dumb. And he ruffles a lot of feathers because he frequently calls economists and people in the financial industry complete frauds and so on and so forth. So I like the fact that he's willing to kind of tell it as it is. And in fact, he says he has his FU money, his fuck you money, because basically he doesn't have to put up with crap from people. He can do whatever he wants. So I really like that about him. And I would highly recommend reading anything that he's written because he has a very interesting perspective on things. He often talks about skin in the game, and he often talks about sort of ancient philosophy and wisdom and so on and so forth. And he says, one of the problems these days is there's no skin in the game. In the past, the Romans used to make their architects sleep under the bridge, that kind of thing. Or in ancient Babylon, if you built a building and it fell down, then you got executed, all of that sort of stuff. So that meant that people built things really well because they really had skin in the game. So he's a very interesting guy. Now, I don't know whether he invented this concept of the barbell strategy or not, but he is the one from whom I heard about this strategy. So he talks about it with regard to investing. And what he says is you want to avoid the middle. The middle is actually nowhere near as safe as people make it out to be. It's actually a lot riskier than people consider it to be. So what you want to do is you want to have investments at either end. You want to have a whole lot of very, very safe, boring, low return investments. And then you want to have, at the other end of the barbell, you want to have some very highly speculative investments that may end up falling in a heap, but may end up making a lot of money as well. And that's actually, counterintuitively, it's it hedges against risk much better than the normal strategy of being somewhere in the middle. So I'm going to take that barbell strategy and apply it to a couple of things here. My general principle with sort of white flight or expatriation or whatever you want to call it is the idea to avoid the middle. And by the middle, I'm talking about polities here. So you want to avoid the city or the local state or province or whatever, or even your nation being heavily invested in those things. Instead, you want to be very focused upon the local, and you also want to be very focused upon the international. You want to avoid the kind of middle ground there, because that's where a lot of people are going to get completely screwed. So firstly, I'd like to talk about employment and that sort of thing. I would suggest that you apply this barbell strategy in the following way. Firstly, do something local. Be very invested locally in terms of your employment. So do something that's very concrete, something that can only be done locally. So people are not going to drive to another town. You know, they're only going to want to drive 10 minutes away from where they live to procure this service or this product. Usually a service. Of course, you know, there's the possibility that someone could come in, immigrants, or someone could come in and undercut you. But generally speaking, you want to do something that's very concrete, and you build your little niche and develop local relationships. Developing local relationships and providing a high quality service and all of that sort of stuff will help to protect you against outsiders coming in and just undercutting you. So you want to get something like a trade or have a small business, or a combination of those two things, or get some sort of qualification in something like becoming, I don't know, a nurse or a vet or something like that, where people are, you know, they're not going to drive 2 towns away to visit a vet, right? They're, you know, as long as the local vet is okay, they're going to go to the local vet, right? Generally speaking, that sort of thing. So something that's very local, that can't be outsourced, it can't be sent overseas, it can't be automated, it can't be accessed online. Anything that can be outsourced, automated, accessed online, any of that kind of stuff, probably will be within the next 10 years or so. All of that is coming. So if you're an accountant, being an accountant, I think, unless you're in some very particular niche or something like that, or, you know, maybe if you're a local accountant just doing people's taxes or something like that, but even then, you know, that could come under threat. But being an accountant, that I think is going to become increasingly risky, because they're going to outsource a lot of that stuff. They'll get that done in India or something like that. So anything that can where people can reduce labor costs, they will. You know, that IT manager that I mentioned before, you know, that's a classic example of that. So unless you get into a very, very particular niche, probably at the very high end, in which case you're probably more, you would probably be employed more for your analytical skills and your ability to lead a team and all of that sort of stuff, to manage people, all of that kind of thing, than you would really for the actual skills of the profession or whatever it is that you would be qualified in. But pretty much I think that route of getting a middle-class white-collar job, something that's sort of very nondescript, you know, you have some sort of strange job title, where someone has to ask you, what's that? If it's like that, then that's probably going to be outsourced or automated, or there's a high chance of it at least. So I would do something that's very local, and, you know, pretty boring, but it's just going to provide you with a stable income, right? The money's just going to come in month by month, right? And you'll be fine with that, particularly if you live in the countryside. At the other end of the barbell, what I would suggest is doing something that's very creative and very entrepreneurial, that probably takes advantage of the internet, so you get access to international markets, and that has the possibility of scaling. Now, what do I mean by scaling? Scaling just means that it can sort of grow exponentially, essentially, without too much or even or without any additional inputs of time or money or whatever. So I'll give you 2 examples of this. One is if you were running a factory and you were producing goods. Now, okay, you do have some inputs, but the main problem with having a factory or something like that is actually setting it up and then just having the machines running. The actual additional cost per item that you produce is probably very marginal. So something like that can scale very well. The difference between making 100 products or 1,000 products, it's not 10 times the cost. But an even better example of scaling is something to do with creative products. So for instance, someone who writes a book or someone who writes and records some music, for them to do either of those two things, and of course there are other examples, they have a big upfront cost in terms of their time. But after that, there probably aren't really very many additional costs. They may have to do some promotional work, but not necessarily. And so if they sell 0 copies of that book or that album, or if they sell 1 million copies of that thing, the cost to them, particularly if it's digital, is basically nothing. And so that scales really well, doing anything that's kind of creative like that. Another example of that is if you make a YouTube video, for instance. Now, I'm probably not the best example of this because I only have 1,500 subscribers. But there are people out there who have millions of subscribers. Now, if we each take an hour to make and upload a video, it hasn't actually, and they have, say, 1,000 times the number of subscribers that I do, it hasn't taken them 1,000 times the effort to get those additional subscribers. That's scaling. So you want to do something that has the potential to scale. Now, it won't necessarily scale. You won't necessarily become an internet sensation or something like that. But there's the possibility, and you might say, right, well, you have to put a lot of time and effort into that. You eventually may actually be able to set it up so that you don't, so, or there might be no recurring effort required. So if you wrote a Kindle book or something like that, there's the time at the start, and then that's, you might do some sort of promotion for it, and then that's pretty much it, and sales will just trickle in over time. But nevertheless, even if you say, right, well, there's this big upfront cost in terms of time, think about this. The average American, and I'm sure this is probably true for people in other countries, the average American spends about 5 hours a day watching television. So if you were to say, well, I'm going to spend 30 hours producing this thing, whatever it is, it's less than a week's worth of television watching. So, is it really that difficult to make these things? Not really. I mean, have an idea, and then act upon the idea. That's what's involved. So these kinds of things, you can probably afford the time. Many people can afford the time, and these things have the potential to scale. You have your nice safe thing at the other end of the barbell that will keep you alive, keep you fed and clothed and housed and all of that sort of stuff. And then you have this other thing that has the potential to make a lot of money, and not just immediately, but over time. There are people who write books for Kindle, for instance, and they sell them for $2 or something on Kindle, on Amazon, and you think, well, that's not a lot of money. But some of these guys have 20 books on there, and they're all bringing in, say, $100 a month, right? Because maybe they get, I don't know, $1 of the sale, so they might make $100 a month. Because think about it like this, right? A lot of people will see a book and they'll say, all right, so it's $2, right? And it's going to solve some issue that they want to address. And they'll think, all right, it's only $2. I mean, that's less than a cup of coffee, or whatever. People will throw away $2 easily on all sorts of stuff, right? And so they go, yeah, right, okay, I'll buy that book, right? So some of these guys are actually selling 100 copies per month of their books, and if they have 20 books, well, they're selling 2,000 copies. So if they're making $1 per book, they're making $2,000 a month from these things. Now, obviously, not everyone's in that situation. Maybe you'll only make $500 a month or something like that. But you sink in all the time at the start, and then the money just trickles in. Or you do something on Fiverr, or what's that other one? Udemy. You can make something for Udemy or a YouTube channel. Any of these things, and the money just sort of trickles in, right? And there's the possibility that it could really go viral, and you can make an enormous amount of money from it, right? So that's what I would suggest. You have the barbell strategy like that. At one end, you have something that's very safe, and it's probably not going to be outsourced or automated or anything like that. So you'll live off that, and then you have this other thing, and you work on that rather than watching vast quantities of television programs or anything like that, or I don't know, going out and getting drunk with your friends on the weekend. You do this other thing that has the potential to make an enormous amount of money. And if you miss a television program, it's not going to be the end of the world, right? But this could change your life. So that's what I would suggest there, the barbell strategy. And I think that will become increasingly viable as big cities become worse and worse in terms of their vibrancy, the pause, the cost of living, the long commutes required, all of this sort of stuff. If you can live in a town in the countryside and it's pleasant enough and all of that sort of stuff, and you can earn enough in some very steady kind of job that's a local job, and you have an internet connection, I mean, most places have internet connections these days, then you can do this other thing on the side. And I think that's going to become increasingly viable. In fact, I think all of those people who have just sunk an enormous amount of time into getting qualified and constantly updating their qualifications, doing all these silly courses that don't necessarily mean anything, and building a career in the city, I think a lot of those people are actually going to be caught out. So this barbell strategy may really get you ahead. Now, the next topic I would like to discuss is what to do with your wealth, where to put it and in what form. Obviously, this very much depends upon how much wealth you have or will have, and there'll be local factors as well from nation to nation and all of this sort of stuff. In some cases, it might be difficult to do some of these things I'm going to discuss due to various regulations, and I'm not going to how do I put this out? I'm not going to endorse any particular course of action here. This is up to you. Think about it yourself and decide what the risks are, or compliance issues and all of that sort of stuff. That's up to you, because it will vary from place to place. But it might be possible to do some of these things I'm going to suggest, because in some cases you need to have a certain amount of money to be able to do them, but you'd be surprised. You don't necessarily need to have an enormous amount of money to be able to do some of the things I'm going to suggest here. So ideally, I would want to have some land in the countryside. So I want to live in the countryside eventually, probably in Australia, and I would want to have not just a house there, but enough land surrounding it such that I could produce my own fruit and vegetables, and probably keep some small livestock there as well. Beyond that, of course, if you think you're going to graze 300 head of cattle or grow enough wheat for your family, that's a whole other endeavor. But nevertheless, at least a couple of acres, which would be enough to have a few, or more than a few, fruit trees and a little vegetable garden, and then have some chickens or whatever as well. I would want to have something like that, because I think that increasingly we are going to see price spikes, if not outright shortages for some resources. And I'll give you an example of this. Probably more than a decade ago now, when I was living in Australia, there was a big tropical cyclone that ripped through Queensland one year, and Queensland's the northeast of Australia, and they grow bananas there. It's tropical, so they grow bananas there, and this cyclone just annihilated the banana farms there. Very few banana farms were unaffected by it, and so of course, supply and demand, the price of bananas skyrocketed because the government refused to allow imported bananas from the Philippines or wherever, probably as a combination of quarantine issues, and also because they wanted to allow the banana industry to get back on its feet. So bananas were hideously expensive for probably 6 months then, and I really like bananas. They're one of my favorite fruits. And so at that point, I probably ate a banana every day or every second day. And then this thing happened, and I don't think I ate a single banana for about 6 months. I was annoyed. I was really pissed off, actually. Every time I went to the supermarket and I'd see the price of bananas, and they were, whatever, 5 or 10 times how much they normally were, I was actually annoyed. And even if you went to some place and they had something that involved a banana on the menu, the price of that, like, I don't know, some banana milkshake or something, was, 3 times the price of any other milkshake. Everyone adjusted their prices, of course, because bananas were insanely expensive. And I don't know who was buying these bananas, because you go to the supermarket, I didn't see anyone else buying bananas there. No one had bananas in their baskets. I don't know what was happening with these bananas. But, there were no bananas for 6 months, essentially, or there were a handful and they were really expensive. Now, that sort of thing could easily come to lots of places, particularly Western Europe, I think, because I think there is going to be conflict in Western Europe. And that's going to mean that supply lines are going to be cut. There will be shortages and so on and so forth. There will be some things that you won't be able to get, and there'll be other things that you will be able to get, but will cost a lot of money. And so, there are some people, very few these days, who are old enough to remember rationing during or after World War II, or even the Great Depression, the cost of things then and the sort of shortages. But very few people, and people in the West have become increasingly soft and used to comfort. And I think many of them are going to be in for a pretty rude awakening, particularly in Europe, in the not too distant future. And so if you could produce some things yourself, now, okay, maybe the government would come and confiscate them, I don't know, maybe they wouldn't. But if you could produce some of these things yourself, then you could actually live okay. We have a mulberry tree. We have a number of fruit trees and bushes and so on, but in particular we have a mulberry tree here in Taiwan. I planted it, I think, about 4 years ago. Yeah, a bit more than 4 years ago. And it was, kind of not even hip high at that time. And it's probably almost twice as tall as I am. It's huge, this thing. And last year it grew about 10 kilograms of mulberries. This year, at least 14. We still have a few left just to end, and we ate some of them without weighing them and all of that sort of stuff. So 14 kilograms of mulberries, and my wife has made about 6 kilos of those into jam, and there are others in the freezer. The other 8 kilos are in the freezer. So that's off one tree. Now, okay, things grow very quickly here in the tropics. I'm in a very hot, humid part of the world, so things do grow very quickly. But nevertheless, your fruit trees can actually yield an enormous amount of fruit, and you don't have to do very much with fruit trees in particular. Occasionally fertilize them. You don't even really have to water them once they're established. The rain will take care of that, and the roots, they'll put down deeper roots and so on. You occasionally prune them, that sort of stuff, but it's very low maintenance having a fruit tree. So if you can produce these kinds of things yourself, I think that will really stand you in good stead. So obviously, having a few acres in the countryside, and I would say in addition to that, you'd probably want to have storage and some energy production, so maybe solar or some generator or something like that, and possibly even timber, a source of timber that you can use for fuel, and a water source and so on. As I mentioned, though, yesterday in my recording, or whenever you're going to hear this, but I recorded it yesterday, there are other people who know a lot more about this kind of thing than me. But eventually I want to get to that point where I know about this sort of stuff and implement it and so on. So I'd want to have some land in the countryside. Some other things that I think are very worth considering are alternative forms of wealth protection or assets or whatever, investments. So things like precious metals, cryptocurrencies, artwork, collectibles, this sort of stuff, because these things are often they move in a different direction to other things, but also because they're not so readily noticeable or assessed by the government and your fellow citizens. Of course, though, you need to know about these things. They do require a fair bit of learning, so that you don't get burnt, because there are a lot of people online who are spruiking these things, particularly precious metals. I mean, you can go on YouTube and find a million and one channels, both of sort of amateurs who are gold or silver stackers, or there's a whole sort of collection of these guys, half a dozen guys in particular, who have their own companies that sell these things, and they have their own newsletters, and every newsletter is sort of apocalyptic. The world is about to burn tomorrow, and gold is going to go to $3 million an ounce or something. Buy gold now, that kind of thing. So you sort of have to be aware of them talking their book and all of that sort of stuff. But these things, they have the potential to be very interesting. I do actually own some precious metals. Basically in the form of numismatics that I bought for my son when he was born. But these things are interesting, and they could be worth investigating, and at least putting a portion of your wealth into. There are things you need to consider. You need to consider storage and protection of these things, obviously, so that because in some cases, or in many cases, these things are a very concentrated store of wealth. So 1 ounce gold coin, an ounce, 1 troy ounce, I think it's about 31 grams, something like that. A 1 ounce gold coin, I'll just look up the spot price. I mean, it might sell for more. Okay, so the spot price today is about $1,250 US dollars. So that's a really concentrated form of wealth, right? So someone could easily make off with tens or even hundreds of thousands of dollars. So you do need to consider storage and safety and all of that sort of stuff. But nevertheless, they could be interesting still. Something else I'll say about them is you also need to think about how you would realize their wealth, how you would make that wealth liquid in a crisis. If you go to some of these channels, people will talk about, oh yeah, you have all these silver eagles, American silver eagles, or Canadian silver maple leafs, or they're sort of the two big ones. And you'll just have a bunch of those, right? But you have to be somewhat skeptical about that idea, because in a crisis, if you just waltz around and sort of throw a silver eagle down, right, I want to buy that thing with this, right? Okay, but you're probably going to draw attention to yourself, at least from people around you, if not the government, and they could come and confiscate or steal those things from you. So you have to be somewhat skeptical about the ability to actually use these things in a crisis. But nevertheless, they might be worth investigating. In the future, I would certainly like to have some of my wealth in these things, or more of my wealth in these things. I'm not really looking at doing anything with the stuff that I've already bought. I'm basically going to keep that and give that to my son when he's a lot older. I'll tell you a couple of things I wouldn't do in terms of white flight and expatriation about locating money. Firstly, I wouldn't have a lot of my net worth tied up in my residence. I've spoken about this before, so I'm not really going to go into too much detail about it. I believe one of my earliest talks was something along these lines. But basically, your primary residence is a liability. It's not an asset. It takes money out of your pocket. It doesn't put money into your pocket. Unless you sell it, but then of course you have to think about where you're going to move to after that. I mean, if you're just moving sideways, horizontally, you're not really making any money. And if your house goes up in value, other houses probably go up in value also, so you're not really going to make any money. But in the meantime, you have to pay all sorts of costs. You have to pay local taxes, you have to pay, and there are transaction fees as well. You have to pay insurance, you have to maintain the place. You might have to spend a lot of time cleaning it, who knows, all of these things, right? So all of that is going to cost you. So your primary residence is a liability, at least in the short to medium term. It's not an asset. So I wouldn't want to have a lot of my wealth tied up in that. Also because in any kind of crisis, real estate is almost, well, probably the most illiquid form of wealth. You can't just pick your house up and run away with it, right? It takes, I mean, you have to find someone to sell it, and it might take you a long time to sell it. Now, you couldn't necessarily sell a stock. You could perhaps at a very low price, very quickly. But a stock is far more liquid. Same with any other kinds of financial instruments and things like gold and so on. You can pick those up and run away with them, right? And actually, I should say one other thing about precious metals. If you do get into precious metals, have physical precious metals. Don't invest in a gold ETF or any of this kind of stuff. That defeats the entire purpose of having gold. You want gold because you have it, you can hold it, you can touch it, you can run away with it, you can spend it, right? Those ETFs for gold or anything else like that, they're just paper, right? If you're going to have paper, then have paper stock investments or something like that, right? Because at least those will potentially give you a dividend or something like that. So yeah, avoid paper gold essentially, because it's not real gold. But anyway, so I wouldn't have a lot of money tied up in my primary residence. Also, and this is probably controversial also, I would not want to have much money beyond whatever is compulsory, whatever the government compels you to do, in any kind of pension or retirement scheme. So I'm talking about these things like in Australia it's called superannuation, or I believe in America it's called an IRA, that kind of thing. I don't know what it's called elsewhere. Pardon me. I would not have a lot of money tied up in this, despite government incentives to, they might give you a tax incentive or something like that, right? Or they might match each dollar you put in with a dollar up to a certain amount, any of this sort of stuff. I would very, very carefully consider those incentives, because there's a reason they're doing that, right? Now, the benign reason is they want everyone to be okay in retirement. The more malign reason is that once you put your money into one of those things, it's very difficult to get it out again. The government has you, and so it's kind of a little honey trap, right? Now, many people don't think of it that way, and it's wrong not to think of it that way. And I'll give you another example of all of this, right? So, several years ago, during the Howard government in Australia, the Treasurer then, Peter Costello, changed the incentives for superannuation, the retirement scheme in Australia. He gave all sorts of tax incentives. So normally, I think up until that point, you got taxed at your marginal tax rate. He said that they were going to have I believe it was a flat rate of 15%. So, but it was going to be upfront, and that's a really important thing. It was going to be upfront, the tax, right? So you're going to get taxed at 15% going in, right? And so, of course, all of these baby boomers poured enormous amounts of money in, right? My father did as well. And people doing this thing called salary sacrificing, where there was sort of, it was like they were earning a lower amount of money because all of their money was going directly to superannuation before they were paid that money, paid their salary or their wage, if you know what I mean. They were sort of they were able to invest first and make it look like they were earning less. So then they got a lower tax rate on the remaining income that they were going to go and spend, right? So there were all of these schemes to get people to just pour huge amounts of money into superannuation, and they did, right, including my father. And then a few years ago, I don't know whether this actually occurred or not, but they were suggesting that they were going to do this. Another government said, well, are we going to tax people coming out? And people were jumping up and down and saying, but, the promise was that we're only going to get taxed going in. To which that government pretty much said, well, that wasn't our government that made that promise. And that's something that governments will always do. They will always say, well, someone else made that promise, that's not our fault, and we have a crisis now, or a looming crisis, we need to do something about it now, suck it up, right? And people were jumping up and down about this, and my father, I remember having a couple of conversations, one in particular, he was livid on the phone to me about, oh, this is so unfair, rah, rah, rah. And I didn't say this because, it would have been like I'm prodding the bear. But I wanted to say to him, well, you're being naive, because of course they were going to do that, right? If they're going to tax you up front and say, we're not going to tax you at the end, we'll only tax you at the start, how long is that going to last, right? I mean, that is just begging for a future government to say, oh, we're going to add a tax at the end as well, right? I mean, if you couldn't see that coming, then you're really naive. I mean, I didn't say that to my father, but no doubt tons and tons of baby boomers were stamping their feet about that, right? So all of these kinds of things, all right, they're going to give you that honey trap, right? Okay, you might want to take it, right? Maybe you can afford to take that risk, right? Not everyone can. You have to think very carefully about this, right? Okay, if everything works out okay, then you might be fine, right? If it doesn't work out okay, then they've got you, right? And really look at the economies, look at the finances of governments all over the West. They are in an absolutely atrocious state. They are saddled with debt. They're saddled with all of these obligations. There are these massive welfare states they're not shrinking, they're growing. By the year, more people are getting the Gibbs than the previous year. The population is becoming extremely dysgenic. If you buy into the whole, all of these the hobgoblins and bugbears of the alt-right and so on, that everything's going to hell on multiple fronts at once, where are the finances going to end up in the future? And if you're someone who has some money, you don't have to be super rich, right? Here is the really important point. The rich don't get taxed. The rich never get taxed, right? The rich are smart enough to have their money offshore or tied up in all sorts of various schemes and so on. And because they're wealthy, they make campaign contributions and all. What would be called corruption if it occurred in a third world country is called a campaign contribution in the West, right? There's all of this stuff. The rich engage in that, right? They don't get taxed because of those things, right? They're too smart and they have enough money that they can buy their way out of the problem. Of course, at the other end of the scale, the poor, well, they don't have anything to tax, right? Many of them have, if they're in a good situation, they have no money. Many of them actually have an enormous amount of debt. They're sort of in the red. Who does that leave? The middle class, right? And what do they mean by the middle class? I mean, if you do these various assessments, pretty much being middle class means having, more than sort of like a couple of $1,000s up to a few million, right? That's the vast majority of people. And that's probably everyone or almost everyone who's listening to this right now. You guys are going to get utterly screwed when the financial systems in the West, when the chickens come home to roost and the financial systems, not necessarily collapse, but they're going to do haircuts and all these other euphemisms they have, right? When all of these things start happening, bail-ins and whatever, it's going to be the middle class who take it in the neck. It is always the middle class who take it in the neck. It's very rarely the rich people. Occasionally in history that happens, right? The French Revolution, right? If that happens, I mean, you don't want to live through the French Revolution phase 2, right? Or anything like that. That's really bad. But if it's less than that, it's always the middle class who take it in the neck. And so any of these kinds of things, these incentive schemes, one way or another, governments in the West are setting the middle class up for a massive fall with these things. Maybe they're not trying to be Machiavellian about it. Maybe they actually really think they're doing a good thing by doing this. But they are setting the middle class up for fall, whether they're aware of it or not. And this brings me to the topic of geopolitical diversification. I think that this is a really neglected issue. People will talk about diversifying within or between asset classes, or even within the same country, or they might have, they'll do something like they'll have some of their money in international shares. Now, international shares basically means this, right? In most cases, if you're in, say, Australia, international shares means money in the US stock market, right? Or American companies. If you're in America, it means, I don't know, money in Canadian companies or something, right? That's pretty much what it means. I mean, they might have some sort of emerging market fund or something like that. But, pretty much it's more of the same, right? So people really sort of, they'll talk about diversification, but they don't really talk about diversification, real geopolitical diversification. If your country experiences a major crisis, economic or otherwise, at the very least, the currency and your purchasing power would be affected, at the very least. It could get a whole lot worse than that. And one way in which it would get worse than that is that there would be increased taxation, if not outright confiscation of wealth. And they will have all sorts of euphemisms for these things. They might call it a haircut or a bail-in, or they'll make up some other silly something like I don't know, crisis levy fund or something like that. Just some silly term, right? Basically, what we're talking about is just straight off the top, they'll take 30% of your money in the bank, or from your stock portfolio, or they might just start levying huge taxes on investment properties, whatever, right? I mean, there are many ways they could do this. And if you think that this won't happen, consider this. In 2013, I believe it was March of 2013, Cyprus experienced a massive financial crisis. And they basically shut down the banks. People couldn't get more than, I think it was about 50 euros a day out from the ATMs. And of course, in the meantime, all the rich people were able to get their money out of the country. I mean, I don't think that was down to incompetence at all. I'm sure that was quite planned and intentional. But so people couldn't get their money out. And I remember one story about an Australian guy who was of Greek Cypriot origin, who had retired to Cyprus, and he had, I think, $1 million in a bank in Cyprus, and he just lost a huge amount of it. Just off the top, they did what was called a bail-in. Those banks were failing, and so the depositors were on the hook for it at that point. So that happened there, and you might say, okay, well, there was Cyprus, whatever, right? Think of this then. In response to that, in November of 2014, so about 18 months later, the G20 nations had a meeting in Brisbane in Australia, and they discussed this, and they basically signed off on the possibility of future bail-ins or future potential bail-ins in their own countries. So most of the people who are listening to this podcast probably live in a G20 nation. So it could happen where you are, right? And here's how it would happen. All of these things, whether we're talking about bank accounts, brokerage accounts for stocks, investment properties, you name it, any of these things could be on the table at some point. And here's what they would do. They would just have an emergency meeting of parliaments. Now, they wouldn't even necessarily have to freeze anything. They might freeze something, but I mean, they could literally just let trading close on Friday night, or they could just wait till the banks have all closed on Friday afternoon, have an emergency meeting of parliament on Saturday. What are you going to do, right? The banks aren't open. I mean, you have a daily withdrawal limit at the ATM or any of these things. They could just say, right, we're going to shut down all brokerage accounts. No one can actually trade anything, whatever, right? By the end of the weekend, or it might take them a bit longer, but they could probably do all of that within a couple of days. What do you do, right? You're up the creek in that situation. And don't think it wouldn't happen. It happened in Cyprus. They sort of dragged their feet a little bit. And I think that's probably so that the rich people could get their money out of the country first. But nevertheless, and when I say rich people, there were politicians who were making these rules who were actually getting their money out of the country whilst the banks were closed. So, the corruption would be everywhere around you. Don't think that your politicians wouldn't be doing this. We've recently seen those that leak of the so-called Panama Papers, and the various Western politicians. I believe David Cameron or someone in his family was implicated in that too. So, they are all up to their necks in corruption, right? What we call corruption if you see on the news something like elections are rigged in the Philippines or Uganda or something, right? We have all of that stuff in the West as well. Some, like Finland or Denmark or something, they're better than other places. But the US, the UK, Australia, they're all up to their necks in corruption. Anyone who has ever been involved with the political party, my father was for many years, and he did business with those people, and so there is an enormous amount of corruption in these places, right? Don't think it wouldn't happen. So what do I mean by geopolitical diversification then? Well, ideally I would suggest having significant amounts of one's money. It doesn't have to be an even split, but significant amounts in at least 3 different countries. Because this would reduce the risk of your government or your fellow citizens cleaning you out, or at least taking a significant bite out of you, which I think is probably a moderate risk, if not a high risk, in many Western nations in the medium term. By medium term, I'm talking 10 to 20 years here, possibly less, due to, actually I think not even the medium term. In in the medium term, I think it's a high risk. In the short term, I think it's a moderate risk. Because Western nations have atrocious economic policies. They're not balancing the books. And that game of musical chairs cannot last forever. It won't. That which is unsustainable will not be sustained. And that's all because of the both the politicians and all of their corruption and so on, and citizens' love affairs with socialism. I mean, my father always says to me, so there's a former Prime Minister of Australia called Julia Gillard, and she was an absolute train wreck. And he always says to me, I mean, not the people on the right are any better, right? But she was from the Australian Labor Party. He always says to me, and we don't have direct, I mean, the only people who voted for Julia Gillard were the people in her electorate, but, although we don't have sort of like a direct presidential election, you are kind of voting for the Prime Minister. But nevertheless, right, he always says to me, when you walk around Australia, just look around you, and every second person you meet wanted Julia Gillard, approximately, because at some point it's whatever, 52%, then it's 48%, right? But, approximately 1 in 2 people wanted Julia Gillard, 1 in 2 adults, because voting is compulsory in Australia. So, almost everyone actually does vote. 1 in 2 people wanted her, right? 1 in 2 people out there pretty much want socialism, give or take, right? You can define it in different ways, but one out of every 2 people you walk past in the street has absolutely no idea about money. And then of the other people on the right, how many of them know about money or have any sort of sensible ideas about anything, right? So, the odds are actually pretty bad here. Many Western countries have an insane love affair with socialism, right? They really, really, really do. And of course, because of that leads to all of these stupid economic policies, and these things are going to fall in a heap in the not too distant future. And if you have money, they're coming after you. Many years ago, my mother's brother, my uncle, was talking with my father, and my father was saying this kind of stuff to him, which is actually why it's interesting to me that my father did end up putting a lot of money into superannuation. But nevertheless, my uncle said, oh, they're not going to tax me, I'm not rich. And my father said, well, define rich. And he said, well, I'm not rich. A rich person is someone who has millions of dollars. And my father said, no, it's not. The average person out there has close to no money, or they're in debt. So therefore, it's sort of like in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king, right? If you have $100,000 or $200,000 or $500,000, you are actually rich, even though that's not really rich, because you're not going to be able to live off that indefinitely or that sort of thing. You're not going to be sailing your yacht to the French Riviera or anything on $200,000. If the person next to you has $10,000, then you're rich, right? And so they're going to come after you, because that guy's not going to have his $10,000 for much longer. And they're going to say, well, you need to spread it around, right? You need to be fair. You need to be nice. All of this stuff that they'll say. And you might say, oh, but that's really unfair. Yeah, but all of those people out there, they still get to vote. And if they outnumber you, they're not going to say, oh, yeah, you know what, you're right. Yeah, it is unfair. We'll just go and sit in a corner and starve to death. They're not going to say that, right? They're going to say, well, it's unfair. You should give us some of your money. That's what's going to happen, right? So you have to consider that. Now, as I mentioned earlier, you need to consider the legal ramifications of this. I'm not going to endorse any particular course of action, because some of these things are legal or not legal or more legal or less legal in various places. But basically, you want to have your money in 3 different places, at least. And when I say different countries, I mean genuinely different countries. So you wouldn't want to have your money in 3 fairly similar countries. So for instance, if you had your money in the USA, Canada, and Australia, that's not what I'm talking about. Those countries are really similar. Countries that have similar ethnic groups, cultures, laws, histories, all of that sort of stuff, are likely to experience similar consequences, in other words, crises, because of the policies they already have in place. and how those things will build up, or how they will be affected by events and trends and all of this sort of stuff. They will have similar consequences, similar crises, because they're similar countries with similar people and similar cultures. And of course, in response to that, because of their similar people and cultures and laws and all of this sort of stuff, they will be likely to produce similar reactions to those crises, whether because of the political process or because of people running out there with pitchforks and torches, right? So therefore, having money in 2 places or 3 places or whatever that are very similar is not really spreading the risk around. It's not really hedging your bets, because the benefits of doing this, okay, there would be some differences. I mean, these countries are not going to have exactly the same crises. They're not going to have exactly the same responses, but they'll be fairly similar. So of course there would be some benefits, but the benefits of doing that sort of thing would likely be outweighed by, or at least counterbalanced by, the costs of doing this, of establishing this, and so on and so forth, and maintaining that kind of diversification in other countries. So that's the first reason why I wouldn't have money in 3 countries that are pretty similar, right? Likewise, countries that have similar kinds of economies, and this tends to go along with countries that are similar ethnically and culturally and so on and so forth. Not entirely, but countries that have similar kinds of economies. For instance, countries that are really big on services, right? Particularly financial services, tourism, education, that kind of stuff. Again, they're likely to experience similar effects, similar outcomes. So you don't want to have money in those kinds of places, because if, for instance, the tourism industry is taking a massive hit and all of your money is spread across countries that heavily rely upon tourism, then maybe it would be localized, but it could be a worldwide thing. I mean, if airliners are being shot out of the sky by terrorists, right, or hijacked or something, then no one's going to want to fly anywhere. So, that sort of thing, right? You don't want to be kind of in the same thing, similar baskets, very close to each other. So what I would suggest doing, and this is something that I'm considering now, I'm on the cusp of getting to this point where I need to really consider this more, is I would have some money in the West, or the Anglosphere, however you want to define all of that. I would have some money in Asia, and I would have some money in a third location. And I actually have money in the West and money in Asia currently, because I live in Asia. So I'm sort of 2/3 of the way there, though I want to have a third and probably even a fourth. So, firstly, let's look at the West. How you define the West will, or differences between the West will, to some extent, depend on where you are. So, for instance, if you lived in the UK, places like the Channel Islands or some other European nations, it's far more likely that any crisis in the UK would probably hit those places as well. Like if you had money in Luxembourg or something like that, because of the geographic proximity of those places and the ways in which they're tied together and so on and so forth. But if you lived in the US or Australia or something, then something like Luxembourg. I'm not specifically recommending Luxembourg, say Switzerland, for instance, right? One of those places would be a lot different than if you lived in the UK, for instance. Those places are kind of closer and more connected. But nevertheless, I would have something somewhere in the West, and then I'd have something in Asia. And you would need to do more research, and I'm going to do more research about this. The preliminary research I've done would seem to suggest that Singapore is better than Hong Kong, and those two are ahead of many other places. I mean, I have money in Taiwan, so that's sort of, do have money in Asia already, so I don't necessarily need to get my money anywhere else in Asia, but though I'm still thinking about it. But I would suggest Singapore over Hong Kong if only because Hong Kong is not truly autonomous. It's it's part of China. They have this one country, two systems approach, but it's really part of China. And if things really get quite crazy in the future, China, Hong Kong is not independent. China will tell Hong Kong what to do, right? So I'd be somewhat wary about having money in Hong Kong. I mean, especially if there's ever any kind of hot war, even a cold war, really sort of openly stated cold war between China and the USA, for instance. I wouldn't put it past the Chinese to just confiscate funds of American citizens or some other Western citizens. So probably Singapore over Hong Kong for that reason, though more investigation is warranted. And then I'd go for a third location, and I would shop around here. I've done a little bit of research on this, but I would shop around. So you have a few broad options here. One is to go the Caribbean route, or sort of a lesser form of that, Latin America. And I'd be a little bit careful about Latin America for reasons I discussed in my previous talk, the first part of this talk. Some of those countries could be okay, but they have a history of instability and nationalizing wealth and all of that sort of stuff, so I'd be very careful about that. But certainly the Caribbean route, or else there are some other little islands around the place, the Seychelles, Mauritius, Vanuatu, I believe. Some of these places are starting to model themselves as tax havens, or have been for a while. And then there are some other options. I wouldn't choose this one. Dubai is another option, because I think if you had money in Dubai, you could inadvertently be funding terrorism. Who knows, right? But that's a concern. So I wouldn't have money in Dubai. But if you weren't so concerned about that kind of thing, that would actually be a place that's very different culturally, very different ethnically, and would have very different laws and all of that sort of stuff. So it would be quite different to the West. And the reason I think that you should have money in Asia or these other locations is because, as I mentioned before, Western nations are pretty much all going to respond in very similar ways. And they're likely to have, if one of them has a crisis, the others are likely to have a crisis also. These other places, firstly, they're not necessarily going to have a crisis or the same crisis. And secondly, because of their different ethnic groups, their different histories and cultures and customs, laws, all of these things, they would quite possibly respond in a very different way. And some of these places are really trying to become places where people can store their wealth. They're trying to make money off that. So in some senses, it's becoming their bread and butter. But also because they are looking at the West and they're like circling vultures. They understand that the West is about to fall in a heap, and people are going to want their money there in Singapore or wherever. And so, they don't want to shoot themselves in the foot in that regard. So they're very aware of all of those issues. Now, of course, you might have some qualms about this, because you might say, well, you don't want your money in the West. You don't want to sort of abandon the West. I mean, the underlying premise with this talk and the previous talk is that people are at least considering white flight and expatriation and so on. So, if you're listening to this, you probably have somewhat of an open mind towards this. But I would say this about all of this issue of sort of at least having your money outside the West, even if you live in the West. Perhaps people will say, well, you're not being very loyal or any of that kind of thing. So I would pose the following questions to you. Your fellow citizens who are getting the gibs, at what point have they stopped to consider you? At what point have they stopped to consider the commonwealth of the country? At what point have the politicians and the elite in general who are looting your countries and selling your countries out, at what point have they stopped to consider you? Where is their loyalty? And you might say, well, I still want to have some ideals and so on. If you're the only one being nice, if you're the only one playing by the rules and no one else is, that doesn't make you honorable, it makes you a sucker. And so I really think that's worth considering. As I said earlier, I think you should have a barbell strategy. I very much think that you should develop deep roots locally if you can. Have loyalty to those people around you and that community. But beyond that, the city, the state or province, even the nation, what does any of that mean anymore? People can get off an aeroplane and literally within 5 minutes they have citizenship in your country now. All of these ancient places in Europe, being British doesn't mean that your family have existed there for 1500 years. They came over in the Anglo-Saxon invasions, or they came over in 1066 or anything like that, right? Being British means you've just been in the country 5 minutes, right? You can be from anywhere in the world and you're British now, right? Because they give you a passport. Now, those of us on the alt-right don't consider those people to be British, but legally they're British. They get to vote. They get to enjoy all the same rights as anyone whose family has been there for 20 generations, right? Or 100 generations. They enjoy all of the same rights as those people, the same in Sweden and many other countries, right? So what does any of that even mean anymore? And if you buy into that, then I think, not to put too fine a point on this, and I'm not trying to insult people here, but you're a sucker if you believe in the nation state. And if you believe that you should do the right thing. No one else is doing the right thing. No one else is doing the right thing. All of the Dindus and Kebabs and everyone else getting the gibs, all of the politicians with their snouts in the trough, all of the elites generally who have their snouts in the trough and are undermining people like you and everything you stand for. The notion of Britain or Sweden or any of these other places that existed 100 years ago, how you may think of yourself and your nationality and your land and all of this stuff, that's gone, at least for the moment. If you continue to think like that, it's only going to make you very vulnerable. So I would say protect yourself, protect your children, protect the people immediately around you. And that may mean that you need to put your money offshore somewhere, at least for a while, until all of this blows over. And then you can repatriate your money. You can bring it back to wherever you're from in 20 years if all of this has blown over by then, or whenever, right? You can do it then if you really want to. But I think right now you're just you're a chicken to be plucked, right? You're a pig that's being fattened for the slaughter, right? So maybe some of you think that's kind of a cowardly way of approaching things. I call it survival. But I think it's worth considering these things. That in the short term, things could go very, very wrong, but you need to think beyond that even. You need to imagine what would happen if things got reasonably bad but not catastrophic. If, the race war never comes, right? Any of that sort of stuff. Or if it drags on and on and on. If any of these things drag on and on, they're not completely catastrophic. There's no kind of Mad Max scenario where people are shooting each other in the streets, or it's not like a Cormac McCarthy novel where they have a basement full of people and they're cannibalizing them. If it's not like that, like Hollywood, what are you going to do in the longer term? Because I think there are going to be ups and downs. Some people will have opportunities and they will profit. Other people on their descent, things will improve for a while before they descend again and that sort of thing. It's not going to be a straight line. And it's not just going to fall off a cliff. I personally think a lot of this stuff is going to be a kind of a jagged decline. And then it may eventually fall in a heap. But there's going to be a jagged decline for a while where it drops a bit and then it kind of levels off or only declines very slowly. And then it drops again. So it's like a series of steps. It's very jagged. I think that you need to consider what you would do for yourself in the crisis, how you would survive, what you would do, and what you would do beyond that point in terms of employment and so on, what would happen with your children and all of that sort of stuff. And you need to think about what to do with your money, where to put it, and in what form, and all of that sort of stuff, so that you can survive and prosper personally, and so that your descendants will be fine also. I think all of these things are worth considering. And as I hope I've stressed, your fellow citizens and your governments at best should be regarded with suspicion, or you should actually really think these people are out to get you. They may not even be malicious about it. The average daft socialist out there, they actually genuinely think that they're good people, and that they're trying to do good for the world. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. So, they may not be fully aware of the implications of their thoughts and all of this sort of stuff, but that doesn't make them any less dangerous. So, this is the end of the talk. Hopefully these things have been thought-provoking. I urge you not to be naive and not to be unduly optimistic about everything. I'm not saying that everything's going to collapse tomorrow. I don't think it's going to happen that way. But I think it's worth being skeptical and cynical to some extent, and therefore responding accordingly. So, as always, if you have any questions, please let me know. And I should also say thank you again, Adam Adams, for prompting me to make this talk. I had actually been considering making this talk for a very long time, even since last year, and I was trying to think of how to kind of work it into things without it just coming out of nowhere. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to do so. And as always, thank you to everyone for listening.